Somewhere in this city, tonight, a man in torn clothing is sleeping on a park bench. He hasn't eaten since yesterday. People walk past him, some sneer, some cross the street. Not one stops. But what if I told you that man has $4.7 billion in his bank account, and everything that is about to happen to him will change him, and you, forever. Before this video ends, you will witness the moment one woman, a complete stranger, did something so unexpected, so quietly powerful, that a billionaire broke down and wept in public for the first time in 30 years. Stay with me, because this is not a story about money. It is not a story about poverty either, not in the way you might expect. This is a story about what happens when the masks we wear in this world are stripped away. All of them, the expensive ones, the cheap ones, every single one. And what is left when there is nothing left to hide behind. This is a story about what human beings are, truly, honestly, without the performance, when they believe no one important is watching. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. The man at the center of this story, the man on that bench, the man the world walked past without a second glance. He did not end up there by accident. He did not fall. He did not fail. He chose it. He chose every cold night, every empty stomach, every moment of being looked through like he was made of glass. He chose it because something happened to him, something he saw, something he could not unsee. And once you understand what that was, once you understand what drove a man worth billions to trade a penthouse for a park bench, you will never look at the world around you quite the same way again. His name is Marcus Ellison, and this is his. Now, before we dive deeper into Marcus's story, I want to ask you something. Think about the last time you walked past someone on the street, someone sitting on the pavement, someone holding a cardboard sign, someone whose eyes met yours for just a fraction of a second before you looked away. What did you think in that moment? What did you feel? And more importantly, what did you do? Because most of us, if we are being painfully honest with ourselves, kept walking. And Marcus Ellison kept walking too. For decades, he kept walking until the day he finally stopped and made himself the one sitting on the ground. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Go ahead and drop a comment right now telling us where in the world you are watching from. We would love to know, because this community reaches people in every corner of this country and far beyond, and that matters to us. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what is coming next in this series is something you absolutely do not want to be late for. Now, there are 3 questions at the heart of this story. 3 questions that are going to pull you through the next 50 minutes. And I promise you, the answers are going to surprise you. Not in a cheap, manufactured way. In the way that real life surprises you when it decides to be more honest than anything scripted could ever be. The first question is this. Why'd one of the most powerful men in America, a man who built a real estate and logistics empire from the ground up, a man who had been on the cover of Forbes magazine, a man whose name was on buildings in 17 cities, why would that man choose to give all of it up, even temporarily, even as an experiment, and go live as a beggar on the streets of the very city where his towers cast shadows over the homeless shelters below them? What was he looking for? What was he running from? And did he find it? The second question is one that cuts even deeper. What does this society, our society, the one we all live in, the one we built together, what does it actually look like when it cannot see your bank account, when it cannot see your title, your address, your LinkedIn profile, your net worth, when all it can see is a man in dirty clothes with nowhere to go? Marcus Ellison was about to find out, and what he found was going to force him to ask questions about himself that no amount of money could answer. And the third question, the one this whole story builds toward, the one that is going to stay with you long after this video ends, is about a woman a 61-year-old woman named Eleanor Brooks, a woman who had no idea who Marcus was, a woman who lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that men like Marcus had spent years quietly pricing out of existence. A woman who worked part-time at a church food pantry and part-time at a dry cleaner, and who by every conventional measure of this world had almost nothing. What this woman did, what she chose to do, not once but repeatedly, for a stranger she had never met and would never ask anything from, is the reason we are all here today. And when you hear it, when you truly hear it, I think it is going to ask something of you. Something quiet and uncomfortable and important. So let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand why Marcus Ellison ended up on that bench, you need to understand the man he was before. The man the world knew, the man the world celebrated, and the man, the private, internal, carefully hidden man, that not even the people closest to him had ever truly met. Marcus Ellison was born in 1964 in Dayton, Ohio. If you know Dayton, you know what that means. You know about the factories. You know about the neighborhoods that hummed with working-class life in the 50s and 60s, and then, slowly, decade by decade, began to go quiet. Dayton was a city that built things, machine parts, paper products, cash registers, and for a long time, that was enough. It was enough to raise families, enough to buy houses, enough to believe that if you worked hard, if you showed up, if you gave everything had to a company or a trade, the world would hold up its end of the deal. Marcus's father, Raymond Ellison, believed that. Raymond worked the night shift at a GM parts plant for 22 years. He believed in the deal, and for a while the deal held. His mother, Beverly Ellison, cleaned offices downtown. She left the house before Marcus woke up for school and returned after he was already in bed. He knew her by the sound of the door, by the smell of the industrial cleaner that clung to her coat, by the way she sometimes left a note on the kitchen table, just a few words in her careful handwriting, telling him what was in the refrigerator for dinner, telling him she loved him, telling him to do his homework. Marcus kept every one of those notes. He has said in the rare interviews where he has allowed himself to speak about his childhood that those notes from his mother were the first things he ever truly treasured, not because of what they said, but because of what they cost her to write. A woman that tired, that wrung out, who still made the effort to leave a word behind for her son. He never forgot that he was a quiet child, observant in the way that children who grow up watching adults struggle tend to be observant, absorbing everything, saying little, filling notebooks with things he noticed that other people seemed not to. His teachers described him as focused. His friends from those years described him as someone who always seemed to be calculating something, always seemed to be 3 steps ahead, always seemed to know where a conversation was going before it got there. He was not cold. He was careful. There is a difference, though the world often mistakes one for the other. He worked his way through Ohio State on a combination of academic scholarships and part-time jobs, construction cleanup, night security, data entry for a property management firm. That last job was where something clicked. He was 19 years old, sitting in a basement office sorting lease files at 2 in the morning, and he started reading them. Not for the job only required him to file them. He read them because he was curious, and what he read changed the direction of his life. He saw the numbers. He saw how much money moved through commercial real estate, how much flowed from tenants to landlords to investors, how many hands it passed through, how little most of the people at the bottom of that chain understood about the machinery above them. He saw the architecture of wealth, and he decided, sitting in that basement at 10 years old, that he was going to understand it completely, and then he was going to build it. By the time he was 32, Marcus Ellison had founded Ellison Capital Group. By 40, the company managed over $2 billion in commercial real estate assets across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. By 50, that number had more than doubled. His portfolio included office towers, logistics warehouses, mixed-use developments, and increasingly, residential properties in urban neighborhoods that were, in the language of the industry, undergoing revitalization. In the language of the people who lived in those neighborhoods, the word for what was happening was different, but Marcus was not, in those years, spending much time listening to that language. He was not a cruel man. That is important to say, and important to mean, because this story does not work if we make Marcus a villain. He was not. He donated generously to hospitals and universities. He funded scholarships for first-generation college students from low-income backgrounds, students who reminded him, though he rarely said so out loud, of himself. He sat on the boards of charitable foundations. He employed thousands of people and by most accounts treated them fairly. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had traveled so far from where he started that the distance had become invisible to him. A man who had been so busy building things that he had stopped looking carefully at what was being built upon. A man who had grown, without fully realizing it, into the kind of person his 19-year-old self would have studied from the outside and filed away, and understood to be very far from him. He had been married once to a woman named Patricia, and they had one son together, a boy named James, now in his late 20s, who worked in finance in Chicago and called his father on birthdays and holidays. The marriage had not survived the company's growth. Patricia had said in the divorce proceedings that she felt she had been replaced, not by another woman, but by a balance sheet. Marcus had not argued with that. He understood it was probably true. He had poured everything he had into the empire, and the empire had consumed what was left. That was the arrangement he had made, and he had made it willingly, and he had lived with it efficiently, successfully, and alone for the better part of 2 decades. So on the surface, in the fall of the year this story begins, Marcus Ellison was exactly what the world believed him to be. A self-made billionaire, a titan of American commerce, a man who had built something extraordinary from almost nothing, a man who had won, and yet something was wrong, something that had been wrong for a long time, growing slowly in the background of his extraordinarily successful life, invisible to everyone around him and almost invisible to him. Almost. Until the night he watched a video on his laptop and something inside him broke open in a way that all the money in the world was not going to be able to close back up. It was a Tuesday night in October. Marcus was in his penthouse office on the 41st floor of the building that bore his name in downtown Columbus, Ohio. He had been there since 6 that morning. It was now nearly midnight. His assistant had gone home hours ago. The city below him was a grid of lights, orderly, geometric, beautiful from a distance, the way cities always look when you are far enough above them that you cannot see the cracks. He was eating a room service meal he had barely touched and reviewing acquisition documents for a mixed-use development in a neighborhood called Franklinton, a neighborhood on the west side of Columbus that worked for generations and was now, quietly but unmistakably, beginning to change. His phone buzzed, a notification from a news alert he kept set for his company's name. He almost ignored it. He had trained himself over the years to process these alerts quickly and move on. Most of them were routine industry coverage, analyst notes, the occasional critical op-ed that his communications team would handle. But this one was different. This one was not from a financial outlet or a business publication. It was from a local Columbus news station, and the headline was 4 words that he had not anticipated: Ellison Capital EVIX veteran. He clicked the link. The article was short, barely 300 words, and it was accompanied by a video security camera footage from a building in Franklinton one of his buildings. A building his company had acquired 14 months earlier as part of a portfolio purchase. He had never set foot in it. He pressed play, and for the next 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Marcus Ellison watched something that he could not look away from, and could not explain away, and could not file under any of the mental categories his very efficient mind had constructed over the years to process the human cost of the decisions he made in conference rooms, 30 stories above the ground. The man in the video was named Gerald Hayes, a name Marcus would not learn until later, but a man he would never forget. Gerald Hayes was 74 years old. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War. He had lived in that Franklinton building for 11 years. The footage showed him standing in the hallway outside his apartment, his door propped open behind him, the contents of his life stacked in boxes and garbage bags around him. He was speaking, calmly, quietly, with a dignity that cost him something visible in his face, to a property manager in a company polo shirt. Gerald Hayes was explaining that he had nowhere to go. He was explaining that his VA benefits had been reduced due to a paperwork error that was in the process of being corrected. He was asking for 30 more days, just 30 days. The property manager, a young man, probably in his early 30s, whose name Marcus would later learn, was Derek Simmons, listened to all of this with his arms crossed and his eyes on his clipboard. And then Derek Simmons told Gerald Hayes that the eviction order had been processed and the deadline had passed and there was nothing he could do. And Gerald Hayes says slowly, the way old men nod when they have learned that the world is not going to make an exception for them, and he picked up the first of his garbage bags and he walked toward the elevator. Marcus watched the video twice, then he sat very still for a long time. The room service on his desk had gone cold. The acquisition documents for the Franklinton development were still open in front of him. The same neighborhood, different building, same story continuing. He thought about calling his operations director. He thought about calling his communications team. He thought about what the right corporate response was, the statement, the investigation, the assurance that this outcome did not reflect the company's values. He had handled situations like this before, not identical, but similar enough. There was a process. There was always a process. But he did not reach for his phone. He sat there in the silence of his 41st floor office, and he let what he had just watched sit in him, without managing it, without processing it, without converting it into a problem with a solution. He let it be what it was, and what it truly was underneath all the legal and operational framing, was a 74-year-old man who had served his country, who had paid his rent for 11 years, who had asked for 30 more days in the only home he had, and been told no, in one of Marcus Ellison's buildings, by one of Marcus Ellison's employees, under policies that Marcus Ellison had approved. That was the truth. Not the only truth, perhaps. There were other truths, procedural truths, legal truths, financial truths, that any competent attorney would cite in Marcus's defense. But it was a truth, and it was one he could not unsee. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk until 4 in the morning, and then moved to the couch and lay there staring at the ceiling until the light came back. And in those hours, without quite knowing why, he began to think about his mother. He began to think about her coat, and the industrial cleaner, and the notes on the kitchen table. He began to think about his father, standing at a factory floor for 22 years, believing in the deal, holding up his end. He began to think about 19-year-old Marcus Ellison in that basement office, reading lease files in the middle of the night, understanding for the first time how the machinery of wealth was assembled. He had understood it from the outside then, from below. He had stood where Gerald Hayes stood, not in a hallway with his life in garbage bags. No, not that exactly, but close enough to recognize the shape of it, close enough to know what it felt like when the machinery treated you as a variable rather than a person. He had known that once. And somewhere in the 40 years between that basement office and this penthouse, he had crossed to the other side of the machine without noticing the crossing. 3 days later, he told his assistant he would be working remotely for the next month. He did not explain further. He called no one else. He went to a Goodwill store on the east side of Columbus and spent $43 on clothes that had belonged to other people. A worn canvas jacket, 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a pair of boots with a separated sole that he fixed with electrical tape the way he had seen men fix shoes when he was a child. He took $200 in cash from his personal account and put it in his coat pocket. He left his phone, his watch, his wallet, every document that connected him to his name and his money in a locked drawer in his apartment. And then he walked out of the building, past the doorman who held the door for him every single morning, past the coffee cart where the vendor always had his order ready without being asked, past the glass tower that had his name carved above the entrance in letters 2 feet tall, and nobody called after him because nobody recognized him. He was nobody. He had made himself nobody, and what the world was about to do with a nobody named Marcus was about to teach him everything he thought he already knew. Now, what Marcus did not know, what he could not have known, was that 30 days on the streets of Columbus was not going to unfold the way a controlled experiment is supposed to unfold. He had imagined on some level that he would observe, that he would take notes, that he would gather data the way he had always gathered data, analytically, at a slight remove, with the understanding that he could step back into his real life whenever the information became sufficient. What he had not planned for was the fact that the streets have a way of making plans irrelevant. What he had not prepared for was the people he was going to meet. And there was one person in particular he had absolutely no framework for. A 61-year-old woman from the east side of Columbus named Eleanor Brooks, who was going to walk into the middle of Marcus Ellison's very carefully designed experiment, and without trying, without even knowing she was doing it, take the whole thing apart at the seams. Day 1 was a Tuesday. The morning was cold, the particular kind of October cold that comes to Ohio like a warning, a preview of what January is going to do to you if you are not ready. Marcus had slept on the second floor of the Columbus Commons shelter on East Gay Street, a city-operated facility that houses up to 240 men on a given night. He had arrived the evening before, filled out intake paperwork under the name Marcus Ellison, close enough to his own that he would answer to it without hesitation, and been assigned a bunk in a room with 16 other men. He had lain there in the dark listening to the breathing and the coughing and the occasional conversation of men who were too tired to sleep quietly, and he had thought about the fact that the sheets he was lying on were the same thread count as his house guest bathroom, only without the laundry service. He thought that was probably going to be the strangest thought he had that night. He was wrong. What struck him first, he would later write in the journal he kept throughout those 30 days, was not the discomfort. It was the invisibility. He had expected hardship. He had not expected erasure. From the moment he stepped outside the shelter on that first morning, with his canvas jacket and his electrical taped boots and his $200 in his pocket, which he had already decided not to spend on anything he couldn't genuinely need, because the point was his experience, not reality, not to cushion it. From that first moment, he noticed it. The way people's eyes moved past him. Not hostility exactly, though there was some of that too, just absence, a refusal to register. He had spent 40 years in rooms where his presence was the event, where his arrival shifted the energy, where heads turned, where hands extended. He had become so accustomed to being seen as someone that he had entirely forgotten what it was like to be looked through, to walk along a sidewalk and have the people coming towards you simply adjust their path slightly, automatically, the way you would adjust around a fire hydrant or a garbage can, not out of malice, out of habit, out of the practice so deeply embedded in American urban life that most people would be horrified to have it named, of deciding in the space of a glance who matters and who does not. He walked to the diner on High Street where he had eaten breakfast every morning for the past 9 years. He sat down at the counter, the same counter he had sat at hundreds of times. The waitress who usually greeted him by name, a woman named Sandra, whose daughter he had helped with a college application 2 years earlier, quietly and anonymously through a third party. Sandra looked at him, looked past him, and walked to the other end of the counter to refill someone's coffee. He waited. After 4 minutes, a different server came over, didn't make eye contact, and asked what he wanted. He ordered coffee and toast. The server wiped down the stool next to him after delivering the order, a small motion, probably unconscious, that Marcus described in his journal as feeling like a door being closed in a room you are already inside of. He wrote, "Sandra does not know me. I understand that. The jacket is different. The stubble is different. I have not shaved in 4 days and my hair is not cut. But the eyes are the same. I have the same eyes." And she did not look at them. She looked at the jacket and the stubble and the boots, and she made a decision so fast it was not even a decision. It was a reflex. I built her daughter's future, and it did not matter, because I was sitting on a counter stool in the wrong coat, and in this world, the coat is the story. The coat is the entire story. By day 4, Marcus had found the shelter's rhythm, the 5:45 a.m. lights, the cafeteria breakfast of scrambled eggs and white bread, the line for the single row of sinks in the communal bathroom, the slow dispersal of men into a city that had no particular need for them during the hours between breakfast and dinner. He had also found, in the bunk diagonal from his, a man who would become the most unexpected companion of those 30 days. His name was Doyle Patterson. He was 58 years old. He was from Youngstown originally, another Ohio city that knew about factories and the slow, devastating mathematics of deindustrialization. Doyle had been a construction foreman for 21 years. He had supervised crews on commercial builds across the state, office complexes, distribution warehouses, the kind of structures that Marcus's company commissioned and Doyle's crews put together with their hands. They had almost certainly been in the same rooms, on the same job sites years ago. 2 men on opposite sides of the contracts, neither of them knowing the other existed. Doyle was in the shelter because of what happens in America when you are 53 years old and you have a heart attack on a job site and you spend 4 days in the ICU and you come out alive but unable to work for 6 months, and your health insurance, the basic policy your union provided, covers 80% of the ICU bill and nothing of the follow-up care or the cardiac rehabilitation or the medications you now need for the rest of your life. Doyle had done everything right. He had worked for 21 years. He had paid into the system. He had insurance. And the gap between what the insurance covered and what the hospital required had taken everything he had, his savings, his truck, and eventually, 17 months after the heart attack, his apartment. He told Marcus all of this on the 3rd night, sitting on the edge of his bunk in the dark after lights out, speaking quietly so as not to wake the others in the calm and even tone of a man who has had a long time to process a great injustice and has arrived, through sheer exhaustion, at something that is not quite acceptance but is something like it. Marcus listened. He did not tell Doyle who he was. He asked questions the way he had always asked questions, carefully, attentively, pulling the thread, and Doyle answered them the way people answer when they feel genuinely heard, which is to say, completely. On day 7, Marcus tried to do what hundreds of thousands of Americans do every day. He tried to apply for a job. He went to the Columbus Public Library on Grant Avenue and sat down at one of the public computers and navigated to the career site for a fast food chain whose restaurant he had passed 3 times that week. The application was digital. Standard fields: name, address, employment history, availability. He filled in the name and employment history fields with simplified, generic versions of real experience, and then he came to the address field, the shelter's address. He typed it in. He submitted the form. The system's automated response came back in 40 seconds. "We are unable to process your application at this time. Please ensure all required fields are completed accurately." All required fields were completed accurately. The problem, as Marcus quickly understood from reading the fine print, flagged in the system, a filter that screened out applicants whose addresses were identified as transitional housing or social services facilities. It was not a human decision. There was no manager reviewing his application and making a judgment. The algorithm had decided in 40 seconds that he did not qualify to flip burgers at $11 an hour. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened the notes application on a borrowed library tablet and wrote, "The barrier is invisible. That is the design. It is not a wall you can see and point at. It is a form on a screen and a piece of code that runs in the background and produces an outcome that looks like a neutral, technical process, but is, in fact, a decision about who is allowed to try." I approved technology upgrades for 3 of our properties last year that probably run a similar algorithm for rental applications. I signed off on that. I did not think about this. On day 12, Marcus was sitting outside a CVS pharmacy on East Broad Street, sitting on the low concrete step near the entrance, eating a granola bar he had been given at the pantry that morning. A security guard came out and told him he needed to move. The guard's name tag read K. Williams. Marcus looked up and recognized him immediately. Kevin Williams, who had worked the lobby security desk in the Ellison Capitol Tower for 6 years, who knew Marcus by sight and by name, who greeted him every morning with the same 2 words, "Morning, Mr. Ellison." Kevin Williams looked at the man on the step in the canvas jacket and the electrical taped boots, and he saw a problem to be removed. He did not see Marcus Ellison. He did not see the man who had quietly slipped $300 into an envelope for Kevin's son's baseball league fundraiser 2 years ago when Kevin had mentioned it in the elevator. He saw what the jacket told him to see. Marcus stood without a word and walked away. He went back to the shelter. He sat on his bunk. He wrote in his journal for an hour. And then, for the first time since he was a young man, he cried. He wrote, "I am not sure what I am crying about. Kevin is not a bad person. Kevin is a good person doing his job. I built that building. I own the pharmacy. I own the land it sits on. I have signed Kevin's employment contract 3 times through our vendor management system." And he looked at me like I was a problem. Not a person, a problem. I wonder how many people I have looked at that way, from behind the glass, from inside the building, and never known I was doing it. He was 17 days in when he met Eleanor Brooks, and nothing after that went the way any experiment is supposed to go. Because Eleanor Brooks did not behave the way the world around Marcus had been behaving. She did not look past him or through him or at the surface of him and make a decision. She looked at him directly, quietly, with the full weight of her attention. And in a month full of being invisible, that single act of being seen, truly seen, as a human being rather than a category, hit Marcus Ellison harder than anything he had experienced in 30 years of doing business at the highest levels of the American economy. She had no idea who he was. She did not need to know. And that, as it turned out, was exactly the point. Eleanor Brooks was born in 1962 in Columbus, Ohio, on the east side, a neighborhood called Linden. which in the 1960s was a working-class black community with strong churches, block associations, and the kind of tight interlocking social fabric that does not photograph well but holds neighborhoods together across generations. Her father drove a city bus for 30 years. Her mother ran a licensed daycare out of their home. Eleanor grew up understanding work, the way people who watch their parents work from a very early age understand it, not as a concept or a career choice, but as the fundamental texture of life. You worked. You showed up. You did what needed to be done. You did not ask for a medal. That was the family code, as deep and unspoken as breathing. Eleanor had been married for 19 years to a man named Robert Brooks, who had been a kind man and a decent father to their 2 children, a daughter named Vanessa and a son named Curtis, and who had died of a stroke at 51, the year their youngest started high school. Eleanor had raised both children to adulthood on her own after that, which meant working whatever hours were available at whatever jobs the east side of Columbus offered a woman in her late 40s without a college degree. Checkout clerk, home health aide, cafeteria worker, dry cleaning attendant. She was not bitter about this. She had, by her own account in the conversations Marcus later described, a fundamental theological conviction that bitterness was a choice and that gratitude was a discipline, and that the latter was harder and more worth practicing. She prayed every morning. She went to church every Sunday. She volunteered at the food pantry at Greater Works Baptist Church 3 afternoons a week, not because it gave her anything materially, but because it gave her what she needed, which was the feeling of being useful in a world that did not always make it easy to find that feeling when you were 61 and part-time and living alone in a neighborhood that every year looked a little less like the one you had grown up in. Her apartment was a 2-bedroom on Woodland Avenue in a neighborhood called Old Day Town East, a neighborhood that had over the past decade become one of the most aggressively gentrified zip codes in Columbus.
Coffee shops and the wine bars
And the renovated Victorians had arrived steadily, year by year, and with them the rent increases that pushed out the people who had lived there for decades and replaced them with people who were very enthusiastic about the neighborhood's character without being particularly interested in where that character had gone. Eleanor's rent had increased 4 times in 6 years. She paid it. She budgeted carefully, ate simply, drove an 11-year-old Honda, and considered herself, without irony or self-pity, to be doing fine. She had what she needed. She had Vanessa and Curtis and her grandchildren and her church and her pantry and her life, which was not large by any external measure and which was, by her own internal measure, completely sufficient. Marcus met her on the 17th day of his experiment. He was standing under the covered entrance of Greater Works Baptist Church on Bryden Road, taking shelter from a rain that had been falling since early afternoon. He was with 3 other men from the shelter, a rotating cast of figures that Marcus had come to know by name and story over the preceding 2.5 weeks. The church was closed for the evening, its interior lights visible through the frosted glass of the side entrance where the pantry operated. It was approximately 5:40 in the evening. Marcus was cold in a way that had stopped feeling temporary and started feeling structural. The kind of cold that occupies your bones and makes you understand, on a cellular level, why warmth is not a luxury. The door opened and Eleanor came out. She was wearing her coat and carrying a canvas grocery tote in each hand and a foil-wrapped package balanced on top of one of them. She looked at the 4 men under the overhang without surprise or hesitation, the way a person looks at something they have seen many times and have decided long ago what to do about. She set the tote bags down. She picked up the foil package. She had made burritos that morning. She would later tell Marcus this when they knew each other better. She had made 12 of them, 2 each for herself and the 6 or 7 regulars she knew she would likely see on her way out. The foil package had 4 in it, and she handed them out one by one, including one to Marcus. She did not ask if he wanted one. She did not make anyone say thank you. She did not linger on anyone's face in a way that required them to perform either gratitude or dignity. She just handed them out, the way you hand something to someone who needs it when you happen to have it. The transaction was so clean, so free of the complicated social weight that charity usually carries, that it took Marcus a moment to register what had just happened. The other 3 men moved on fairly quickly. Tucking into their food as they walked, Marcus stayed. He did not plan to stay. It was not a decision so much as an absence of departure. A stillness that came over him in the presence of this woman who had just performed an act of ordinary decency so gracefully that it had made him, for a disorienting moment, feel the full weight of every time he had not done the same. Eleanor noticed that he had stayed. She pulled a milk crate over from against the wall, turned it upside down, and sat on it. She looked at him. She asked his name. He said Marcus. She asked if he had eaten that day, beyond the burrito. He said barely. She nodded, not with pity, but with the neutral acknowledgement of a woman processing information. And then she did something that Marcus had not experienced from a stranger in many years, possibly decades. She asked him a question about himself that she was genuinely interested in the answer to. Not a probing question, not a diagnostic question, not the kind of question social workers and outreach volunteers are trained to ask in order to assess need and connect people to services. She asked him where he was from originally, and she waited for the answer like it mattered to her. They talked for 40 minutes in the rain, under that overhang. Marcus told her about Dayton, about his father at the factory, about his mother's notes on the kitchen table. He did not tell her about the penthouse or the company or the buildings. He told her true things, the truest things about himself, the things that were true before the money, the things that were still true underneath it, and she listened to them the way his mother had listened to him when he was a child, with complete attention and no agenda. When she spoke about her own life, about Robert, about the pantry, about the East Side and what it had looked like when she was young and what it looked like now, she spoke without a complaint, without the performance of struggle, without any apparent need for Marcus to validate or respond to what she was sharing. She was simply telling him things, the way people tell each other things when they have decided, quickly and irrevocably, that the person they are talking to is real. At some point in that conversation, Eleanor said something that Marcus wrote down in his journal that night, verbatim, and then underlined 3 times. She said, "You know what I notice about people out here? They all look like they're waiting for someone to tell them they still matter." She paused for a moment and looked out at the rain. Then she said, "The sad thing is most of them did matter. To somebody somewhere they just got lost in between." Marcus looked at her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have added to what she had just put in the air between them. He wrote later, "She was not talking about them. She was talking about me." She could not have known that, but she was, somehow, in the way that people who pay very close attention to the world sometimes know things they have no technical way of knowing. She was talking about me. He found her at the pantry again the next day, and the day after that, she brought extra food when she had it. She brought him a coat on the 5th day, a new coat from the Burlington Coat Factory on Morse Road, with the tag still attached. He saw the tag. He understood immediately what it meant, that she had spent money she did not need to spend on a person she had known for 5 days. He asked her why she had bought it new. She shrugged in the way of someone who considers the question slightly beside the point. She said, "Seemed like the kind of thing where new was better." Marcus turned the coat over in his hands. He was holding, in that moment, a $47 Burlington coat factory jacket purchased by a woman who made barely enough to live on. For a stranger she believed was homeless, and the gesture was so disproportionate to anything the world had any right to expect from her that he had to concentrate very hard on not reacting in a way that would require explanation. He wore the coat. Of course he wore it. It would have been an insult not to. And on the 22nd day, the day that Marcus would later describe as the day the experiment became something else entirely, something he had no word for, he told Eleanor a partial truth. He told her he had been offered an opportunity to get back on his feet, a connection, a job lead, something that might be real, but he needed $40 to cover bus fare to Cleveland and a document processing fee. He watched her face carefully as he said this. He was testing something, not Eleanor, not her specifically, but himself. He was testing his own assumptions about what people with almost nothing do when asked to give what little they have. He expected hesitation. He expected the gentle, apologetic decline of someone who wants to help but cannot afford to. What he got was Eleanor opening her purse, counting what was inside. He could see her lips moving slightly as she counted, and taking out 2 20s. She had $67 in that purse. She gave him 40 of them. She kept 27. She handed the money to him and said, "Don't you let pride cost you a second chance." And then she closed her purse and changed the subject, because she had not given the money in order to be thanked for it. And the subject of the money was, for her, already closed. Marcus took the $40. He held them in his hand for a moment, 2 20s, slightly worn, the way money gets when it circulates among people who handle it carefully because it has to last. And he thought about the fact that earlier that same week, in a property review meeting conducted remotely from a library computer, he had approved a budget adjustment that moved $400,000 from one line item to another without reading the supporting documentation, because he trusted his CFO's summary. He had done that without thinking. And here was a woman holding out $40 she could not spare, with a steadiness and a certainty and a lack of drama that made it the most significant financial transaction he had witnessed in 30 years of billion-dollar deals. He took the money. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome," and told him to call her when he got settled. He wrote her phone number on the inside of his wrist with a pen she lent him. And then he walked away, and when he was around the corner and out of her sight line, he stood against a wall for a while, with his eyes closed, and tried to understand what was happening to him. Marcus Ellison returned to his penthouse on the 30th day, a Thursday morning, in the coat Eleanor had given him. His staff were, collectively, trying to appear composed about his absence, which they had been told to explain as an off-site working retreat, and doing so with varying degrees of success. His assistant, a meticulous young man named Aaron, had left a stack of correspondence on his desk and said, with characteristic restraint, "Welcome back, sir. You look," and then paused. Marcus said different. Aaron said yes. Marcus said good. And then he went into his private office, closed the door, and sat down on the floor, not at his desk, on the floor, and stared at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows for a very long time. What he had brought back with him was not a plan. It was something harder to name and harder to act on, a clarity so sharp that it hurt the way your eyes hurt when you come out of a dark theater into afternoon sunlight. He had gone in looking for the wicked society, looking for the cruelty, the indifference, the machinery of exclusion that grinds the vulnerable into invisibility. He had found all of it. It was there, abundant and systematic and chilling. What he had not been prepared for, what no amount of prior reading or social consciousness or charitable giving had prepared him for, was Eleanor, was Doyle. was the particular quality of human decency that he had encountered among people who had every reason to have none of it left. The wickedness was structural. He had been right about that. The grace was personal. The grace was individual. The grace was a 61-year-old woman on a milk crate in the rain asking him where he was from, and meaning it. The following week, Marcus called his senior leadership team into the boardroom. He did not give them a preview of what was coming. When they were all seated, he reached into the bag he had brought with him and placed the Burlington Coat Factory jacket on the center of the conference table. It lay there, worn, slightly damp, stained from a week of November weather, the price tag still hanging from the inside collar where Eleanor had forgotten to remove it. The 12 people around that table looked at it and then looked at Marcus and waited. Marcus said, "I need to tell you where I've been and what I found and what we're going to do about it." He spoke for 45 minutes without notes. When he was finished, the room was very quiet. What Marcus proposed was not cosmetic. It was not a PR initiative or a charitable foundation established at a comfortable arm's length from the business decisions that created the problems in the first place. He proposed 3 concrete structural changes to Ellison Capital Group's operating policies. The first was a 5-year moratorium on no-fault evictions across all residential properties in the portfolio, a policy that would require case-by-case human review of every eviction proceeding, with a default toward finding alternatives. The second was the establishment of a $20 million community stabilization fund to be administered independently of the company, focused on affordable housing preservation in neighborhoods where Ellison Capital was an active developer. The third was a partnership with Columbus area workforce organizations to redesign the employment pipeline for Ellison Capital's managed properties, specifically eliminating the address screening algorithm that had rejected Marcus's own job application on day 7 and replacing it with a process that evaluated applicants on documented skills and availability. There was resistance, not universal, but significant. One board member, a man Marcus had known for 15 years, a man whose children had grown up alongside Marcus's son, told him plainly that the proposals were operationally disruptive, potentially costly, and the word he used, carefully, was unprecedented. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I slept in a shelter for a month. I watched a 74-year-old veteran carry his life out of one of our buildings in garbage bags. I was told to move by a security guard I've employed for 6 years who didn't recognize me because I was wearing the wrong coat. If unprecedented is what it takes to address what I saw, then unprecedented is what we're going to be." The meeting ended. The proposals were approved. He called Doyle Patterson 3 days after returning. He had the shelter's contact information from his own intake records. He reached Doyle through the facility coordinator. He told Doyle who he was. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Doyle said quietly, "I had a feeling you weren't exactly what you seemed." Marcus said he was sorry he hadn't been honest. Doyle said he understood. Marcus asked Doyle if he would be willing to come in and meet with him, not to be helped, not to be given something, but to consult, to sit across the table from Marcus and the housing initiative team and tell them what the system looked like from where Doyle had been standing for the past 3 years, because Marcus had found in those 22 days of shared shelter bunks and cafeteria breakfasts that Doyle Patterson understood the operational mechanics of human dignity in distressed communities better than anyone Marcus had ever hired. Doyle said he would think about it. 2 days later, he called back and said yes, and then there was Eleanor Brooks, who had fed him and clothed him and listened to him and given him $40 she could not afford, and told him not to let pride cost him a second chance. Marcus drove to the pantry at Greater Works Baptist Church on a Wednesday afternoon. He walked in wearing a coat that was not the Burlington jacket. A simple, decent coat, nothing conspicuous. And he waited until Eleanor had finished with the family she was serving. She turned and saw him. The look on her face was not surprise. It was recognition, which was different. The quiet, assessing recognition of a woman who had seen something true in someone and was now simply confirming that she had been right. She said, "I wondered when you'd come back." He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "I think I already know." And they sat down at the same plastic table where they had sat together 17 times over the course of those 30 days, and Marcus told her everything. He told her about the penthouse and the company and the buildings, including, without flinching, the ones in her neighborhood. He told her about the eviction video and Gerald Hayes and the night he decided to leave. He told her about the job application, the algorithm rejected in 40 seconds, and the coat she bought him and the $40 in the journal entry he wrote that night. He told her all of it, and Eleanor Brooks listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she had always given him. Complete, quiet, non-performative, and when he was done, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "So what are you going to do?" Not what had he done, not what did he plan. What was he going to do? Present tense. An active, continuing question. Marcus pulled an envelope from his inside pocket and slid it across the table. In the envelope was a certified check for $500,000, made out to Eleanor Brooks personally. He told her it was to buy her apartment outright, eliminate any debt, and give her freedom he could not give her earlier, but could give her. Now Eleanor looked at the check. She picked it up. She read it. She set it back down on the table and looked at Marcus for a long moment with the expression of a woman deciding something carefully. And then she slid it back across the table to him. She said, "What I did for you, I did because it was right, not because I was owed something back. If you take that money and make it a transaction, you will have missed the whole point of everything that happened between us." Marcus stared at her. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked her what she would accept. She thought about it. She looked around the pantry, the cramped kitchen with the single working oven, the folding tables, the donated equipment that had been donated because it was too old for whoever donated it. She looked at the ceiling where a water stain had been spreading for 2 years. She said, "Give this kitchen what it needs to do, the work it's trying to do. Give the shelter a roof that doesn't fail in winter. Give the people in this neighborhood something that will still be here after you've moved on to the next project." Marcus nodded. He was crying by then. Quietly, without apology, the tears of a man whose emotional infrastructure had been under significant strain for 30 days and had, in this moment, finally given way. He did not look away or compose himself or reach for a response that would restore professional distance. He sat there at the plastic table in the food pantry and cried in front of Eleanor Brooks, and Eleanor handed him a paper napkin without comment because she was a practical woman and that was what the situation called for. Greater Works Baptist Church received a full commercial kitchen renovation 4 months later. The Columbus Commons Shelter received $2.3 million in structural repair and facility upgrades. Eleanor Brooks accepted a paid advisory role with Ellison Capital Group's Community Housing Initiative, a role she described in an interview with a local Columbus nonprofit newsletter as embarrassingly well compensated for what is mostly common sense. When the interviewer asked her what she thought of Marcus Ellison, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's a man who got lost and found his way back. That's not so unusual. What's unusual is that he was honest enough to admit it. Most people who get that lost just keep walking." She paused. Then she smiled. "He came back. That counts for something." Marcus Ellison went looking for the wicked society. He found it. It was in the algorithm that rejected him in 40 seconds. It was in the security guard, who told him to move from the steps of a building he owned. It was in the server who wiped down the stool beside him. It was in the eviction system that processed Gerald Hayes's life in garbage bags with the clean efficiency of a business process. It was real, and it was structural, and it was not the product of individual malice, but of 10,000 small decisions made by people at desks in offices like the ones Marcus had occupied his entire professional life. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the individual level and catastrophic at the aggregate. Decisions that, taken together, produce a world where the coat you wear determines whether you are a person. The wicked society was not the only thing Marcus found. He also found Doyle Patterson, who had done everything right and lost everything anyway, and who sat in a shelter bunk in the dark and talked about it with the dignity of a man who has decided that what happened to him does not define who he is. He found the man at the soup kitchen who always saved an extra serving for whoever came in last. He found the teenager who pressed a bus pass into the hand of a stranger without stopping to explain why. He found, in 30 days of walking the streets of a city he thought he knew, 100 small acts of human generosity that never make the news and never appear on anyone's balance sheet, and that are, nonetheless, the load-bearing walls of a society that has not yet collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And he found Eleanor Brooks, who gave him food, who gave him a coat, who gave him $40 she could not spare, who listened to him as an equal, who slid a $500,000 check back across a table and told him he had missed the point. Eleanor Brooks, who was born in Linden and raised in a church and watched her neighborhood change around her and kept showing up anyway, to the pantry, to the folding tables, to the milk crate, in the rain. Because that is what you do when you understand that the world is not going to get better on its own, and that each person's portion of the work is simply to be decent in their own small radius every single day, without waiting for recognition or reciprocity or proof that it matters. Eleanor Brooks, who was not trying to be an angel, who would tell you she is absolutely not an angel, and would say so with the particular mild exasperation of a woman who has been told this too many times by people who seem to think it lets them off the hook for not doing the same thing themselves. The question this story ends on is not about Marcus Ellison. Marcus Ellison has answered his question, imperfectly, partially, with more work still ahead of him than behind. But he has answered it. The question is about the rest of us. The question is about the $40 in our own pockets and the strangers in our own sight lines and the small daily decision, made 100 times a day, made so fast it barely feels like a decision at all, about who we are willing to see and who we are willing to look past. The question is whether we have, somewhere in the daily machinery of our very efficient lives, created a distance between ourselves and the people who need what we could give. Not $500,000, not a housing initiative, not a board resolution, just a moment, just a milk crate pulled over and set upside down, just the question asked and the answer waited for like it matters. Just the act of being present, without agenda, in the same rain. Would you have stopped?
Not Marcus Ellison. You.
Would you have stopped? Drop your answer in the comments. And while you are there, tell us where in the world you are watching from. This community reaches people in every state in this country and in countries we never expected. And every time someone tells us where they are, it reminds us why we do this work. Hit the subscribe button if this story moved you, because what is coming next in this series is something we have been working on for months, and it is going to ask you the same kind of question, the kind that follows you home. Thank you for watching.